There is a zone in the South China Sea, roughly 90 kilometers across, that appears on nearly every major maritime chart produced by nearly every major maritime authority in the world. British Admiralty charts, American NOAA charts, Chinese charts, Japanese charts, Australian, French, German, Philippine. It does not matter who made the chart or what country commissioned it. The zone is there, marked, delineated, given a shape and a boundary and a position on the page, and it has no label. No notation, no explanation, no asterisk leading you to a footnote, no color key that accounts for it. Just a boundary, drawn on water, that every chart maker in the world apparently agreed to draw, and then apparently agreed to say nothing about. When you first encounter this, when someone who knows what they are looking at points to it on a nautical chart spread across a table, your first instinct is to assume you are missing something, that the notation is somewhere else on the chart, that the legend covers it, that this is some standard designation you simply do not recognize because you are not a maritime professional. But then you look at the charts made by different countries, different agencies, different cartographic traditions, and the zone is there in all of them, in the same location, with the same approximate dimensions, and the silence around it is consistent. The same deliberate, coordinated, internationally maintained silence. And that is when the question that does not have a simple answer begins to form. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the world the way it actually works. Not the surface version, not the version that gets summarized into a headline, but the deep version, the one underneath everything else, the one that takes real time and real attention and rewards both completely. Let's go. To understand why this zone exists, why it is marked, and why it is marked without explanation, you have to understand something about the South China Sea itself, something that goes much deeper than the contemporary political disputes that dominate coverage of this region. Because the South China Sea is not primarily a political story, though the politics are real and consequential. It is primarily a geological story, and a historical story, and a story about how nations interact with certain categories of reality that they would collectively prefer not to define too precisely. And the zone we are talking about is a product of all three of those things simultaneously. Let us start with the geology, because the geology is where everything else begins. The South China Sea sits on top of what geologists call a marginal sea basin, a body of water enclosed or partially enclosed by island arcs and continental margins, formed by a process of rifting and seafloor spreading that began roughly 32 million years ago when tectonic forces began pulling the region apart. The basin that opened up as that rifting proceeded is now an ocean floor that drops in places to more than 5,000 meters below the surface. But the edges of that basin, the continental shelves and shallow banks and reef systems that fringe the deep water, are extraordinarily complex in their topography, and that complexity is what makes the South China Sea one of the most ecologically rich and geopolitically contested bodies of water on the planet. The Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, the Scarborough Shoal, the Protus Islands, the Macclesfield Bank, these are the names that appear most often in contemporary coverage of South China Sea disputes, and they appear because they are the features that countries are actively contesting. But the shallow banks and seamounts and reef systems of the South China Sea are only the most visible part of a much more complex subsurface geography, a geography that includes underwater plateaus, ancient river valleys now drowned under hundreds of meters of water, volcanic formations, and a series of sedimentary basins that contain some of the largest unexploited hydrocarbon reserves in the world. The estimates of the hydrocarbon resources under the South China Sea vary enormously, depending on who is making them and what methodologies they are using, and what political interests they are serving by making those estimates. The United States Energy Information Administration has estimated recoverable oil reserves in the South China Sea at somewhere around 11 billion barrels. Chinese government estimates have at various times suggested figures 10 times higher, in the range of 125 billion barrels. Independent geological surveys have tended to produce numbers closer to the lower American figure, but have acknowledged that the surveys of certain areas are incomplete. The range of these estimates is itself informative. It tells you that large portions of the South China Sea seafloor have never been comprehensively surveyed, and that the surveys that have been conducted are proprietary, conducted by national governments and energy companies who do not share their findings freely. And underneath all of this, underneath the competing resource claims and the incomplete surveys and the political disputes, there is the question of what happens at the boundaries of jurisdiction. Who has the right to survey? Who has the right to drill? Who has the authority to determine what is there? And it is precisely at one of those jurisdictional boundaries, or more accurately, at a place where multiple jurisdictional frameworks intersect in a way that cannot be cleanly resolved, that the zone we are talking about is located. To understand the jurisdictional situation, you need to understand the legal framework that governs maritime space, which is primarily the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, usually abbreviated UNCLOS. UNCLOS, which was negotiated through most of the 1970s and finalized in 1982, is one of the most ambitious attempts in human history to impose a coherent legal order on a physical reality that does not care about legal order. It established a system of maritime zones extending outward from coastlines, a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, over which a coastal state has essentially sovereign authority, a contiguous zone extending another 12 miles, in which the state can enforce certain laws, and most importantly for our purposes, an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles from the baseline of the coast, within which the coastal state has exclusive rights to explore and exploit the natural resources of the water column, the seabed, and the subsoil. 200 nautical miles is approximately 370 kilometers. It is a long way. And in a semi-enclosed sea like the South China Sea, surrounded by multiple countries on multiple sides, those exclusive economic zones overlap. They overlap extensively, and the framework that UNCLOS provides for resolving those overlaps, essentially requiring neighboring states to negotiate bilateral agreements to delimit their respective zones, presupposes a willingness to negotiate and a shared acceptance of UNCLOS as the governing framework. In the South China Sea, both of those preconditions are partially absent. China's position with respect to the South China Sea is anchored in the 9-dash line, a claim that extends across approximately 90% of the sea and that has no basis in UNCLOS. The 9-dash line, or 10-dash line in Chinese maps that include Taiwan, is derived from an 11-dash line that the Republic of China government published in 1947, based on historical claims to the sea that predate the UNCLOS framework by decades and that interpret the concept of historical maritime rights in a way that the international community largely rejects. In 2016, an arbitration tribunal constituted under UNCLOS at the request of the Philippines issued a ruling that the 9-dash line has no legal basis in international law. China rejected the ruling and has continued to assert its claims. The practical consequence of this legal standoff is a situation in which multiple overlapping legal frameworks claim authority over the same bodies of water, and in which there is no mechanism to enforce any resolution. And in the middle of this standoff, certain physical realities of the sea cannot simply be wished away. The fish still swim, the oil is still in the ground, the ships still need to navigate, and the charts that those ships navigate by still need to accurately represent the physical geography, including the parts of the physical geography that are most politically sensitive. And this brings us back to the zone. The zone is located in the area of the South China Sea that overlaps with a particular set of competing claims, where the exclusive economic zones of at least 3 different countries intersect with Chinese historical claims in a way that creates what maritime lawyers call a triple overlap zone. In triple overlap zones, the normal procedures for maritime delimitation break down because you cannot simply draw a median line between 2 coastlines when there are 3 or more coastlines and several mutually incompatible legal frameworks all claiming the same water. In most parts of the world where maritime boundaries are genuinely contested, what happens on charts is one of several things. The chart might show the claimed boundaries of all parties with different line styles, a solid line for one country's claim, a dashed line for another's, with a notation explaining what each line represents. The chart might simply omit all claimed boundaries and show only uncontested international waters, or the chart might show a single delimitation line based on the chart maker's government's position, which is what Chinese charts do with the 9-dash line. But what almost never happens is what happens with this particular zone in the South China Sea, which is that a boundary is drawn that is consistent across charts from multiple different countries and that carries no explanation of what it represents. The fact that this consistency exists is itself a clue. Because in the normal course of maritime cartography, different countries draw different things when they disagree about what they are drawing. The consistency of this zone across jurisdictionally opposed chart-making authorities suggests that the zone is not representing a claimed political boundary, since if it were, different countries would claim it differently. It is representing something that all parties agree is there, even if they agree on nothing else. The zone is marking a fact, not a claim. And the fact it is marking is geological. I want to take you to a specific geological feature now, because understanding this feature is the key to understanding why the zone is marked and why no one wants to annotate it. The feature in question is called a sedimentary basin, but that description understates what it actually is. Think of it this way. Over millions of years, rivers carry sediment to the sea. Sediment accumulates on the seafloor in thick layers. The organic material in those sediment layers, the dead plankton and algae and marine organisms that sink and are buried, is compressed and heated by the weight of the layers above it over millions of years. Depending on the specific chemistry of the sediment, the temperature it reaches, the pressure it is under, and the time that elapses, this organic material can be transformed into hydrocarbons, into oil and natural gas, and the resulting deposits can be vast, measured in volumes that human imagination struggles to fully hold. In the South China Sea, the seafloor contains multiple major sedimentary basins, and the unmapped or incompletely mapped zone we are discussing sits over one of the most geologically significant of these basins. What makes this basin unusual, and what makes the zone unusual, is a combination of factors. The basin is deep, both in the sense of being physically deep beneath the seafloor, which means access is technically difficult, and in the sense of being geologically deep in time, which means the organic material within it has had a very long time to transform into hydrocarbons. The preliminary survey data that has been made available from adjacent areas suggests that the basin may contain reserves substantially larger than those in the surrounding areas that have already been identified. But preliminary survey data is not a resource estimate. It is an indication that a more thorough survey is warranted. And the more thorough survey, the kind that would produce a defensible estimate of what is in the basin, requires physical access to the area, the deployment of seismic survey vessels, the drilling of exploratory wells, and the analysis of cores taken from hundreds or thousands of meters below the seafloor, all of which requires a legal framework that establishes who has the right to conduct those activities. And that legal framework in this particular area of the South China Sea does not exist in any form that any of the relevant parties have agreed to. So the zone is marked on charts because it exists as a physical and geological reality. And it is not annotated, because annotating it would require describing what it is, and describing what it is would require acknowledging who has the right to its resources, and acknowledging who has the right to its resources would require resolving a dispute that has been deliberately left unresolved by every party involved, because every party calculates that the uncertainty is preferable to the outcomes that a forced resolution might produce. This is the kind of thing that maritime cartographers call a sensitive notation, and the culture of sensitive notation in maritime cartography has a history that is worth understanding because it predates the South China Sea disputes by centuries. The history of maritime charting is fundamentally a history of knowledge being both shared and withheld simultaneously. The early charts of the Age of Exploration, the Portolan charts of the Mediterranean, and the later charts that extended European geographical knowledge to the Americas, and Asia, and Africa, were commercial documents before they were anything else. A captain who possessed an accurate chart of a coastline, of its hazards and its harbors and its depths, possessed a competitive advantage that could translate directly into profit. The knowledge on those charts was valuable, precisely because it was not universally available. So chart makers developed conventions for indicating areas where information existed without fully specifying what that information was. A warning without a description. A marking without an explanation, a notation that tells the mariner that something is there worth knowing about, without telling them exactly what or exactly why. This tradition of significant silence in maritime cartography has carried forward into the modern era in ways that are more sophisticated but recognizably continuous with those early practices. Modern admiralty charts produced by naval hydrographic offices contain certain standard notations, danger zones, prohibited areas, areas with unexploded ordnance, areas where specific navigational cautions apply, and they also contain, in certain cases, markings without standard notation, zones that appear on the chart with a boundary, but without the coded abbreviation or color fill that would tie them to a specific regulatory category in the chart's legend. When maritime professionals encounter an unmarked zone on an admiralty chart, their professional training tells them two things simultaneously. The first is practical. The zone is there for a reason, and the prudent mariner gives it appropriate consideration. The second is political. The absence of notation means the zone is in a category that the issuing authority has chosen not to define. And in the world of contemporary maritime charting, the most common reason for that choice is jurisdictional sensitivity. There are other examples of this pattern in other parts of the world, though the South China Sea example is among the most consistent in its cross-jurisdictional appearance. There are zones in the Arctic Ocean that have appeared on charts without full notation, as the Arctic's resources and navigation routes have become increasingly significant in the context of climate change. There are zones in the Eastern Mediterranean related to the hydrocarbon disputes between Greece and Turkey and Cyprus that carry incomplete notation on charts from different national authorities. There are zones in the Western Pacific related to the historical aftermath of nuclear testing programs that appear differently on American, French, and Marshallese charts. But the South China Sea zone we are examining is notable for the specificity of its boundary, the consistency of its appearance across antagonistic chart-making traditions, and the particular quality of the geological reality it is marking. Because the geological reality beneath this zone is not just about hydrocarbons, though the hydrocarbon dimension is significant. It is also about something that is in certain respects even more fundamental to the long-term dynamics of power in this region: water. Specifically, the underwater geology of the zone is associated with a structure that geologists have identified as an aquifer, a body of porous rock saturated with groundwater that is of unusual significance in a region that is experiencing accelerating freshwater stress. The countries surrounding the South China Sea are home to several 100 million people, and the freshwater systems that support those populations, the rivers, the rainfall, the groundwater reserves, are under increasing pressure from population growth, agricultural demand, industrial use, and the shifts in precipitation patterns associated with climate change. Submarine aquifers, bodies of freshwater stored beneath the seafloor in porous rock structures, are a known feature of continental shelves around the world. They are formed during periods when sea levels were lower than they are today, typically during ice ages, when what is now the seafloor was dry land, and the groundwater that accumulated in the rock during those dry periods was then sealed under the seawater as sea levels rose with the end of the ice age. In some cases, these submarine aquifers remain isolated from the surrounding seawater and retain their fresh or brackish quality. In other cases, over time, they have been contaminated by the infiltration of seawater. The submarine geological structure associated with the zone in the South China Sea is understood, on the basis of available survey data, to include a substantial freshwater component. The precise extent and quality of that freshwater has not been comprehensively surveyed, in part because of the access and jurisdictional issues we have already discussed. But the available data is sufficient to indicate that the structure exists and that it is significant. The significance of a large submarine freshwater aquifer in the South China Sea context goes beyond the immediate question of water supply, though that question is not trivial in a region of increasing freshwater scarcity. It extends to the question of what UNCLOS and international maritime law say about the exploitation of resources that exist in the seabed versus resources in the water column versus resources in the subsoil beneath the seabed. Because the legal framework treats these differently. And a submarine aquifer, which is a subsoil resource, carries a different legal status than the fisheries in the water above it, or even, in some interpretations, the oil and gas in the rock beside it. The legal question of who has the right to exploit a submarine freshwater aquifer in a disputed maritime zone has never been definitively resolved by any international tribunal, because the issue has never been brought before one in a form that produced a definitive ruling. This is not an accident. It reflects the same political calculation that keeps the notations off the charts. The question is live but unresolved, and the parties prefer unresolved to the risks of resolution. Let me take you now into the history of how this zone was first identified, because the history involves a cast of characters and a sequence of events that is itself remarkable, and that helps explain why the contemporary silence around the zone has the specific shape it does. The first systematic scientific surveys of the deeper geology of the South China Sea were conducted primarily by American research institutions and government agencies in the 1950s and 1960s as part of the broader expansion of oceanographic science that followed the Second World War. The war had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the strategic importance of understanding the underwater geography of the ocean, not just for navigation, but for submarine warfare, for amphibious operations, for the deployment of communications cables, and the laying of mines, and the tracking of enemy vessels. After the war, the military investment in oceanographic science continued and expanded, and the South China Sea was a priority area for American survey work because of its strategic position in the Western Pacific and its relevance to the Korean War and later the Vietnam War. The The survey data collected by American oceanographic ships in the South China Sea in this period was classified for decades. Some of it remains classified, but the portions that have been declassified, or that were shared through scientific channels with other maritime powers over the subsequent decades, provide the foundation for what is now understood about the geology of the sea, including the geological features associated with the zone we are examining. The specific identification of the zone as a geologically distinct and significant area came through a combination of seismic survey data, which maps the structure of subsurface rock layers by measuring the propagation of sound waves through them, and gravity survey data, which detects variations in the density of subsurface rock by measuring tiny changes in the gravitational field at the surface. Both techniques can be deployed from ships at the surface without any physical access to the seabed, and both are regularly used in preliminary resource assessments. The pattern of seismic and gravity anomalies associated with the zone was identified in the 1960s and early 1970s, and the identification was shared with allied maritime powers through classified scientific channels. The Chinese government, which was not party to those classified channels at the time, conducted its own surveys of the South China Sea, beginning in the 1970s, using survey vessels that were less technically sophisticated than American equivalents, but that operated in areas American vessels were reluctant to enter because of the military sensitivity of the region during the Cold War. The Chinese surveys covered some areas that American surveys had not, and the data from those Chinese surveys, the portions that have been made public, confirms the geological significance of the zone from a different direction. Two independent survey traditions, one American-led and one Chinese, both identified the same geological structure. The zone is not a diplomatic fiction. It is a geological reality that multiple independent sets of instruments have detected. The implications of this independent confirmation are significant because it means that when cartographers from different countries and different political traditions mark the zone on their charts, they are not copying each other or deferring to a common authority. They are reflecting convergent knowledge from separate survey traditions. The consistency of the marking is not a political agreement. It is a scientific one. And yet the silence around the marking is political. The particular shape of that political silence has evolved over the decades since the zone was first identified. In the 1970s and 1980s, when the UNCLOS framework was being negotiated and the modern legal architecture of maritime jurisdiction was taking form, the zone was understood primarily as a future resource question, something that would need to be addressed once the legal framework was in place and the political relationships among the surrounding countries had stabilized enough to permit the kinds of negotiations that would determine access rights. In the 1990s, as China's economic growth accelerated and its naval capabilities expanded, and as the other countries of Southeast Asia were simultaneously growing and developing their own maritime interests, the question of the zone became more urgent and more politically charged. The energy resources that the zone potentially contained became more economically significant as oil prices rose and demand for energy in the region increased. The countries that might have access to those resources were increasingly capable of asserting their claims. And the competing legal frameworks, UNCLOS on one side and China's historical claims on the other, were increasingly directly in conflict rather than occupying separate intellectual spaces. In this context, the decision by chart-making authorities to mark the zone without annotation was not a decision to ignore it. It was a decision to acknowledge it in the least provocative way available, to say here is something that exists without saying who it belongs to or what it means or what anyone intends to do about it. The silence is a form of active avoidance, carefully maintained, serving the interests of all parties by preserving the ambiguity that allows the dispute to continue without forcing the confrontation that a direct assertion of rights would precipitate. The people who actually make navigational decisions about this zone, the captains of commercial vessels, the operators of research ships, the navigators of naval vessels from multiple countries, have developed their own practical understanding of what the zone represents. Not from the charts, which tell them only that it is there, but from informal professional knowledge passed through maritime communities. Every significant maritime professional community has its own oral and institutional knowledge about areas that charts mark but do not explain. The South China Sea Zone is one of the best known of these among maritime professionals, widely understood in rough terms as a geological hotspot in a legally unresolvable disputed area, the combination of those two facts being what produces the particular quality of attention it receives from anyone who has to plan operations in the region. The military dimension of the zone deserves attention because it has become increasingly central to the politics of the South China Sea in the 21st century. The reason the military dimension is specifically relevant to the zone, as opposed to other parts of the South China Sea, is again geological. The same features of the seafloor that make the zone significant for resource purposes also make it significant for submarine operations. The specific depth profile of the water column above the zone, and the particular way that temperature and salinity gradients are arranged in that water column as it deepens toward the seafloor, creates acoustic conditions that are highly favorable for submarine concealment. Sound travels through water in ways that depend on the temperature and salinity and pressure of the water, and these properties vary with depth in patterns that change with season and geography. Under certain conditions, a layer of water with particular temperature and salinity characteristics can act as a kind of acoustic mirror, reflecting sound away from submarines operating beneath it and making those submarines extremely difficult to detect from above. This phenomenon, known as a SOFAR channel or deep sound channel in some contexts, and in its shallower manifestations called a thermal layer or acoustic shadow zone, is one of the most important factors in submarine warfare, because a submarine that can position itself beneath an effective acoustic layer becomes much harder to find. The water column above the geological zone we are discussing has, as a consequence of its specific temperature and salinity structure, an acoustic shadow zone that is particularly effective for portions of the year. This has been understood by naval authorities from multiple countries since at least the 1980s, and it influences both the routing of naval vessels through the area and the choice of positions for submarine operations. The zone is marked on navigational charts, in part because it is a navigational reality, an area where certain classes of vessels operate in ways that other vessels in the vicinity need to take account of. The combination of resource potential, legal ambiguity, and military significance creates a situation in the zone that has no clean resolution in the near or medium term. The geological reality is not going to change. The hydrocarbon and freshwater resources, if they are as substantial as the available survey data suggests, are not going to become less valuable as the countries of the region continue to grow. The acoustic characteristics of the water column are not going to become less relevant as submarine technology continues to develop and the strategic competition in the Western Pacific intensifies. And the legal framework is not going to resolve itself into clarity as long as China maintains its historical claims and the other claimant states maintain their UNCLOS-based counterclaims. What this means for the zone is that the silence around its marking on charts is likely to continue and likely to deepen as the stakes associated with the silence increase. The more valuable the zone becomes, the more important it is that no party is forced to make a definitive claim that forecloses options or triggers a direct confrontation. The ambiguity is expensive to maintain, but less expensive than the alternatives that would result from its collapse. There is a particular class of geopolitical situation that scholars of international relations call a frozen conflict, a dispute that has not been resolved, but that has also not escalated into direct military confrontation, usually because the costs of resolution are perceived by all parties as higher than the costs of continuation. The South China Sea disputes broadly fall into this category, and the zone we have been discussing is a kind of concentration point for the frozen quality of the broader conflict, a place where the freezing is visible in the most literal possible way, in the deliberate inscription of a boundary without meaning on the navigational charts of the world. But frozen conflicts are not truly frozen. They evolve. They change in response to shifting power relationships, technological developments, environmental changes, and the slow accumulation of facts on the water that eventually produce a reality that the legal frameworks and the diplomatic silences can no longer contain. And in the South China Sea, the facts on the water have been accumulating at an accelerating rate. China's construction of artificial islands on reefs and shoals throughout the South China Sea, beginning in earnest around 2013, and proceeding at a pace that astonished outside observers, represents the most dramatic example of the creation of new facts in the disputed waters. By building structures on submerged or barely exposed reefs, and then claiming that those structures constitute islands with their own maritime zones, China has attempted to physically alter the legal geography of the sea. The strategy has been partially successful in the sense that the artificial islands now exist and are occupied and are capable of projecting both civilian and military presence across a much wider area of the South China Sea than China's natural land features would support. It has been less successful in the sense that the international community, and particularly the United States and its allies, have refused to accept the legal claims associated with the artificial islands, conducting regular freedom of navigation operations in the waters surrounding them to deny the implication that those waters have become Chinese territorial sea. The zone we have been discussing has not been the site of artificial island construction. The water above it is too deep for the kind of reef building that China has conducted in other areas. The depth of water above the geological features associated with the zone ranges from several hundred to more than 1,000 meters, far too deep for the construction techniques that were used on the much shallower reefs of the Spratlys. This means that asserting physical control over the zone, in the way China has asserted control over other parts of the South China Sea, requires either the development of new construction techniques, which is theoretically possible but has not yet been attempted, or the acceptance that control over the zone's resources must come through a different mechanism. The different mechanism that has been most actively pursued in recent years is the deployment of survey vessels into the zone, vessels that conduct seismic and other subsurface surveys, and in so doing, both gather data that is useful for resource assessment and assert a form of presence in the disputed water. Chinese survey vessels have operated in or adjacent to the zone on multiple documented occasions, and those operations have been accompanied by naval vessels that serve as escorts and as a form of enforcement of China's claim to access the area. Survey operations by vessels from other claimant states have been similarly accompanied by naval escorts on multiple occasions, and the resulting interactions between naval vessels of different nations in the waters of the zone have, on several occasions, come close to direct confrontation. The survey vessels that operate in this way are doing something that is simultaneously scientific and political. They are gathering data and they are asserting presence. And the data they are gathering will eventually be sufficient to produce resource estimates specific enough to change the calculations of the parties involved. When someone has a precise estimate of what is in the geological formations beneath the zone, precise enough to build a business case